Do you know that the entire generation of Japan is lost and hopeless for the future? A lost generation in Japan is still jobless at 40 and still lives with their parents. We are talking about 3.4 million people between the ages of 40 and 50 in Japan who still haven't been emancipated from their families. How did this happen? Let's find out how this situation is in full detail. But first, please like and subscribe to the channel and then sit back and relax. The growing economic inequality trend poses a significant threat to security and growth, even in countries like Japan that have experienced decades of economic stagnation. Among the most vulnerable are the country's youth, who are facing rising unemployment rates and increasing uncertainty and despair. However, Japan does not recognize poverty as a social issue and lacks policies to reduce it, presenting a challenge to the country's democracy. In the 1990s, Japan attempted to address the inequality brought on by globalization through reforms, restructuring, and transformations. But not all young Japanese can access the benefits of welfare and success in the 21st century. The failure of previous generations to address these issues has led to a sense of hopelessness among younger generations, which stands in contrast to the ideals of a rich, equal, and happy world that were embraced by the youth of the 1960s and 1970s. Reports suggest that Japan is now one of the most unequal societies in the world in terms of social inequality. In this video, we refresh the idea of an unequal society to explain the deepening of poverty and the feeling of hopelessness that is becoming more acute in that country, especially among young people, and the effects that this situation has on the Japanese economic model. Thus, poverty is not just a matter of income, it is a matter of feeling excluded from society, not having access to social services and benefits, and the inability to fulfill oneself as a person. In Japan, the issues of poverty linked to income refers to the standard of living of the population, the cost they pay for having access to services, and the precariousness of employment, while in social terms, poverty also represents failure and hopelessness. According to Japan Bureau of Statistics data updated to July 2014, in the second quarter of 2014, Japan had a labor force of 66,220,000 people, of whom 63,750,000 were employed. While the total unemployment rate was 3.7% in July 2014, the unemployment rate among youth in the 15 to 24 age group was 6.8% and 7.3%, according to the World Bank at the end of 2013. While the long-term unemployment rate has grown to 33.3% and reached 66.8% in the case of those who only have primary education. This trend is not exclusive to Japan, since 40% of the world's young people between the ages of 15 and 24 are unemployed. Youth unemployment is a tragedy because it cancels out the possibility of a better future. According to experts, although there are more jobs for young people than for middle-aged or older people, there's a polarization between jobs where working conditions are extremely difficult and those jobs that are easy and do not demand special skills of the employees. In the last 20 years, the so-called Japanese-style capitalism analyzed by authors such as Johnson and Nakamura has changed due to stagnant growth, financial crisis, and restructuring. This has caused companies to reduce the number of employees and in some cases to abandon social protection systems such as lifetime employment. The last official census in Japan in 2015 revealed that there were 3.4 million people between the ages of 40 and 50 who had not married and were still living with their parents. The Japanese government has developed plans to help 300,000 people in the next 3 years who were excluded from the labor market in the last 20 years, to give them new job opportunities and achieve their family emancipation. Opportunities only happen once in a lifetime, and this blunt phrase usually sums up the strict hiring system in the third largest economy on the planet. After graduation, college students have the best chances of getting a good, steady, salary job with the possibility of regular promotions and promotions. If you can catch this train, you are pretty much doomed to low-paying jobs with little chance of promotion and no job security. The powerful Japanese economy has been without significant growth since the late 1990s. And with the crisis, companies significantly reduced new hires to protect older workers. It is said that the labor market entered an ice age that began to leave out a whole generation that is currently between 40 and 50 years old, and that they have already been surpassed by the later generation, younger and with greater possibilities to maintain the labor market trend. Who is going to fish out the workers who have been left fallow for years? To cut costs and protect elder workers, companies have resorted to temporary contracts which offer lower wages and reduce social benefits. Those jobs are the first to be eliminated during a recession, but they are also the first to be added back during recovery. Almost 40% of Japan's labor force now belongs to a newly constituted subclass of non-regular workers. About 68% of this contingent in 2019 were women. According to a government survey, Japan has an estimated 613,000 middle-aged hikikomori, a term typically used to describe socially awkward youngsters hiding in their bedrooms. 1 in 3 people in their early 40s who were interviewed in Japan in March 2019 stated they had walled themselves away because they had difficulty getting or keeping a job after graduating from college. Out of the labor market at 20. The media covered this social problem after a terrible crime which they dubbed the 80-50 problem, about lonely middle-aged Japanese who live with their elderly parents. The brutal knife attack at a bus stop in Kawasaki in May 2019, carried out by a man in his 50s who had been out of work for many years and lived with his family, left 2 dead and 18 injured, including 2 children in school age. The attacker stabbed himself to death. A month after the attack, a government unveiled its plan to help those excluded from the job market in their youth to offer them full-time jobs, to reach 300,000 people over 3 years. The Bloomberg reports give the example of Michinao Kono, a 45-year-old man without a job who has never left his parents' house. Kono's background suggested that he would have a bright future as his father worked for one of Japan's well-respected trading houses that were key to the post-war economy. With his father's comfortable income, the family could afford a car and a house with a front yard, which marked them as prosperous in a country where the goal was for everyone to be middle class. Despite entering Kyoto University, which is one of Japan's oldest and most prestigious institutions, Kono struggled to connect with others and became a social outcast. He eventually gave up on the customary job search activities that college students undertake, where they attend crowded recruitment events and group interviews while dressed in formal suits. After 8 years of university and no job prospects, he retreated to live with his parents, and his days turned into weeks, and the months turned into years for him. Single women at 40 have it even harder. The situations for women without work or home at this age is even more complicated. In a country where traditional attitudes about gender roles have slowly evolved despite government policies designed to accelerate this change. Former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's administration pushed to equalize wages, as Japan's top president frequently bragged about the record number of women in the job market, a promise never kept. Jobs for women pay on average 30% less than their male colleagues doing essentially the same job, as most continue to live with their parents. Many companies expect that women will quit once they get married. The Bloomberg report takes Yu Takekawa, 38, unemployed since March and making do with her unemployment benefits and savings. After graduating from Rikkyo University, specializing in German literature, she decided to seek employment in a distribution company, although it has allowed her to write 3 books. The recessions led her to intermittent contracts in real estate companies and has been punishing her with social and self-confidence problems. Both go to a non-profit organization that brings together middle-aged reclusiveness and their elderly parents and organizes meetings where they share their stories to get out of isolation. But this situation is worsening with the arrival of the coronavirus. Greater uncertainty with the coronavirus. Japan's economy contracted 28% year-on-year in the April-June quarter, the biggest drop since the post-war period. Some large companies, such as Japan Airlines Co. or the tour operator HIS, have stopped recruiting university students, while almost 78% of those surveyed in a study carried out on small and medium-sized companies by the Japan Chamber of Commerce and Industry in midsummer confirmed that the pandemic is affecting the hiring of future graduates. The RecruitWorks Institute survey measures the annual level of job openings for recent graduates in companies. For the class of 2021, the ratio is projected to drop by 1.53 jobs per graduate from 1.83 this year. The ice age of employment seems to be returning to Japan. The lost generations of Japan is what awaits young Spaniards after the crisis. With youth unemployment at 40%, it's time to see what happens if the government does not help improve the economy quickly. Entire generations without job opportunities. At 40 years old, they have not yet been emancipated. They continue to live with their parents, single, childless, and jobless. They have thrown in the towel in life. They know that they are no longer attractive in the job market and that the possibility of starting a new life is impossible. They believe that all that life has in store for them is to take care of their parents, inherit their house, and wait for death. They are Japan's lost generation. Nearly 3.4 million people living in despair because they will never live. Based on a trusted report which has gone to Japan to tell how these people live, its story follows a common pattern. The labor market was stuck in a deep crisis between 1993 and 2004. Consequence? Mass layoffs and company bankruptcies left hundreds of people on the street. Those most affected by this strike are known as the lost generation. But as the economy revived, the older and more tenure-holding people clung to their chair and status as a generation plug. To compensate, companies opted for temporary and precarious employment contracts that allowed them to quickly dispense with young people if lean times return. Yes, like in Spain, this meant that an entire generation had no chance of competing against anyone for a job. According to the point of view of the companies, for temporary and precarious jobs, it was better to hire recent graduates since if they hired someone with no experience, it would be better if they were young and had more energy. Furthermore, this generation was also ineligible for the best positions because their resumes were empty, inexperienced, and unappealing to a recruiter. Result? Millions of bitter and sad people because they feel that they have failed in life and that they will not be able to get out of that rut. Now, they spend their day-to-day locked up in their homes without going out more than necessary. They are a kind of hikikomori, but due to their economic conditions, they live with shame because in such a competitive country, they have not managed to prosper in the workplace. There are government aid programs to reintegrate them, but the jobs are very precarious, slave-like, and unsatisfactory, which is why many people end up leaving them. This question of the lost generation is an example of how a badly managed crisis can cause deep labor inequalities in entire generations. And in Spain, caution must be taken. The generations of the 2008 crisis, who had to go out to work as much as they could or even stayed here studying while they couldn't find a job, has run to a certain extent with the situation. Hyper-qualified people with many studies but with very little experience feel that they are no longer young and they are outside the usual market. Or now, during the COVID crisis, with youth unemployment at 40.6%, more than double the European average. This is a very pessimistic conclusion for a problem that affects too many people who feel that time is passing and they have fewer and fewer opportunities to enter the labor market with dignity. Tetsuya Ishida put a face to the lost generation in Japan. The Palacio de Velázquez is hosting a retrospective of this cult artist who committed suicide at the age of 32. As we said earlier, in the 1990s, Japan suffered a devastating economic crisis due to the real estate bubble and financial speculations, which left a terrible legacy, the so-called lost generation. Young people with no future buried and trapped between two ways of being in the world. On the one hand, the karoshi, which means death from overwork. On the other, the hikikomori, which means boys who lose their identity and decide to live in almost total isolation, locked up in their rooms and sheltered in the anonymity of the internet. A generation trapped in an oppressive space and time, where there is no separations between life and work. One of the artists who best addressed the alienation and dehumanizations of contemporary Japanese society in his work was Tetsuya Ishida, a cult painter to whom the art gallery dedicates a comprehensive retrospective, the largest held to date outside of Japan. Tetsuya Ishida himself ended up being swallowed by the system as one more victim who died at the age of 32. He committed suicide by throwing himself on the train tracks. The suicide rate in the Asian country is terrible, but Ishida had time to create a very personal work, a crude pictorial realism with surreal overtones, starring exclusively one character, a clone who repeats himself obsessively on his canvases and who has often been associated with the self-portrait of Ishida, although he denied it. Rather, it is a self-portrait of another, hence the title of the show. Kafkaesque overtones. A character with Kafkaesque overtones trapped in impossible, dystopian spaces who metamorphoses into insect larvae, but also transforms into anthropomorphic machines. Sinks, toilets, sinks, tires, escalators, planes, tanks, buildings. A painting shows his characters fed through a hose plug into their mouths. In another, a body is cut up and packaged as if it were one more commodity in the production chain. It is a bitter and devastating denunciation of the loneliness, isolation, and lack of communication in which the Japanese live immersed in their lives and their work. There are no borders between one and the other, but his criticism does not focus only on slave labor. It also triggers education and schools as domestication spaces that trigger the disorientations and introspection of adolescents. Although apparently it is a cold painting without emotion, there's a lot of humor and irony in his works, a certain melancholy, and it produces empathy. He does not recreate the pain of others. In addition, there are reminiscences of manga and anime in his work. The exhibitions, curated by Teresa Velasquez, brings together 70 paintings, drawings, and notebooks made by Ishida between 1996 and 2004. The curator says that there is no political commitment in Ishida. He talks about the traumas, apathy, and despair of the youth today. Consumption occupies all leisure time, and they are the consequence of excessive use of technology, which prevents us from disconnecting. The character created by Ishida is a figure of an affective orphan sentenced who seems incapable of reversing his unfortunate fate. Although his work was seen a few years ago at the Venice Biennale, he is an artist little known outside his country. Loans for the exhibition comes mainly from Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Korea. The exhibition will keep its doors open until September 8. Then, he will travel to a new space in Chicago, revamped by Taro Ando, Rightwood 659. They say that in 2006, when Ishida's works were shown on a Japanese public television program, the reactions of the viewers was incredible. Many people felt fully identified with those images. Ishida, who had died a year earlier, suddenly became one of the most famous young painters in the country. Above all, the story of Japan's lost generation is enough lesson to teach the rest of the developed countries and those with structural economic problems. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit like, the subscription button, and the notification bell. To get notified when new videos are uploaded from this channel, please share your thoughts about the dark side of Japan, the lost generation in the comment section below. Thank you.